Their apartment.
It was the epicenter of art and literature.
Artists and writers.
Pablo Picasso.
Matisse.
Stein.
Incredibly vibrant.
27
27.
to 27 Rue De Fleurus.
Paris, one of the great cultural cities of the world, infamous for its influx of creative expats and the natives who adore such outsiders. I've always wondered what calls to great artists and innovators to gather in a central geographic location. The inexplicable magic of a place that facilitates avant-garde art movements, fresh philosophies, and progressive politics. I want to examine what incubates such innovation, why creative minds or great innovators generally seek out central meeting places, and why such public spheres may be crucial in being successful. To find out, we'll go deeper than any country, province, city, or even district, but to one Parisian apartment that allured the early 20th century's greatest creative minds. Between the Eiffel Tower and the Luxembourg Gardens sits a modest apartment on the Street of Flowers, Rue De Fleurus. American writer Gertrude Stein, along with her partner Alice Toklas, resided at the address 27 Rue De Fleurus. From 1905 to 1938, they hosted weekly gatherings called salons. Visitors were vetted by a simple question. Who sent you? And regardless of the answer, the guest was invariably welcomed in. The question was merely a formality for the GI Joes, regular Joes, artisan collectors, tourists, and art students. A continuous stream of patrons were allowed to indulge in all 27 had to offer. Among the visitors to the salon were Ernst Hemingway, Pablo Picasso, and Henri Matisse. It touched the most inventive art movements of the 20th century: Fauvism, Cubism, Dadaism, Surrealism. It was the center of the lost generation of writers. A term introduced by Stein includes Hemingway, F. Scott Fitzgerald, T.S. Eliot, John Steinbeck, and others.
The studio was the most fascinating of any place in Paris because everyone did go there, but once a week she'd have a tea party. All of the people, the young people of consequence and without money.
Although the most progressive, Stein's studio wasn't a novel concept. Even during the same time, there were plenty of other established meeting places in Paris which artists frequented. To understand the significance of Stein's contributions, we must look back to the birth of these French institutions, which originated nearly 3 centuries before. The traditional salons were not receptive of American expats, tourists, or really just poor people generally. First appearing in 16th century Italy, literary salons really began to flourish in 17th century France. In their infancy, salons were pretty much glorified book clubs of the French aristocracy, but would quickly become something more substantive. Women played a vital role in the operations of salons at every century, guiding conversations on writing, philosophy, and politics. They also had the financial freedom and leisure to facilitate these gatherings. For whatever reason, the late 17th and early 18th century saw the decline of the aristocratic salon, which gave rise to the academic Enlightenment salons. These gatherings represented a great shift from court society to more democratic theaters of conversation. Despite continuing to be rather elitist, the following centuries became increasingly more concerned with formal dialectic meetings, tangible progress, and an expansion into arts and science. These salons were limited in their subject matter, limited in their diversity of patrons, and limited in their notable offerings to a broader society. Why Gertrude Stein's salon is so remarkable above all others is its significant role in facilitating a public sphere which transcended literature and politics, beyond class, beyond disciplines, catalyzing some of the most prominent art movements in modern history. Stein's family were of the first Americans to support the European Avant Garde, and they had the disposable income to do so meaningfully. Pablo Picasso survived on the Stein's patronage in his early career, even immortalizing Gertrude Stein in a painting preceding his full adoption of Cubism. This painting adorned the walls of 27 and was accompanied by works from Matisse, Renoir, Braque, and others. The apartment was later deemed the world's first museum of modern art. It was this astounding collection of work that initially attracted visitors. Hemingway, in his book A Movable Feast, described his early impression of Stein's home.
It was like one of the best rooms in the finest museum, except there was a big fireplace and it was warm and comfortable, and they gave you good things to eat and tea.
A young Hemingway often saw Picasso at Stein's salon, where he learned about art and developed his taste by discussing Picasso's work with the man himself. Picasso similarly showed an interest in writing. On one account, Picasso even insisted on reading some of his poetry to the crowd at 27, with Stein and Hemingway present. With great enthusiasm, Picasso read his works aloud, believing if he imbued his writing with the same energies and imagination as his paintings, he could be a great writer as well. The hushed crowd listened intently as Picasso began to read, and kept reading, and eventually concluded the performance. It was quiet. Hemingway stared at Stein, waiting for her verdict. And finally Stein spoke.
Pablo,
She said gravely.
go home and paint.
Anyway, Picasso and Hemingway were both inspired by painter Paul Cézanne. The foundation of Cézanne's work, and really the defining movement of art at the time, was deconstructing nature into its simplest forms and then reconstructing it from those essentials. For Cézanne, color; for Picasso, shape; and Hemingway, prose. Deceptively simple execution, uniquely capable of precisely articulating moments or feelings. A movement inspired and developed by the innovators crossing paths at Stein's studio. But surely Hemingway would have been a good writer without chatting with Picasso or studying Cézanne, right? Beyond the suave, smart guy optics of hanging around a variety of intelligent people, is there real value to these interdisciplinary collaborations? Does a painter need to study writing? Does a writer need to understand paintings? You only have to look to the most universally acclaimed thinker, artist, and engineer of our species' history, Leonardo da Vinci. In Da Vinci's time, there too was a central geographic hub of innovation, Florence, Italy. And like Paris, it had a statistically significant amount of geniuses per capita for its era. Great minds flocked to Florence and reached new heights because of it. Da Vinci is significant here not arbitrarily due to his ubiquitous notoriety, but because he was incredibly well documented in his collaboration with others, consulting with experts of disciplines outside of his own speciality. You're probably familiar with Da Vinci's notes. The masterful sketches, the mere scribing from a genius long, long ago, always dazzled me growing up, especially his flying machines and tanks. Apart from the drawings, we get an intimate insight into much of Da Vinci's daily life because of his meticulous note-taking. A common entry were questions he intended to ask friends and colleagues.
Have the master of arithmetic to show you how to square a triangle. Get Messer Fazio to show you about proportion. Get the Brera Friar to show you the ponderibus. Ask Benedetto Potinari by what means they go on ice in Flanders.
And one of these interdisciplinary collaborations resulted in the Vitruvian Man. Da Vinci's unique capacity for artistic rendering, paired with his careful observation of proportion, allowed him to interpolate the words and studies of Vitruvius into a perfect visual representation. Da Vinci himself was not as perfect. We only understand his full genius because of these unpublished notebooks. If he had published any of his findings, entire fields would be decades or even centuries ahead of their time. Da Vinci would have been a historical figure for his studies in dentistry alone. His greatest shortcoming was seeking the help and knowledge of others, but not reciprocating that interest in publishing his own findings. And it's unlikely he was being deliberately sneaky. He was just so caught up in everything else he was doing. Gertrude Stein possessed a similar shortcoming, but hers was not as forgivable. Rather than sharing in Da Vinci's indifference to published acknowledgement, she was conversely overly eager to propagate herself as a genius. Stein was publicly denounced for some assertions made in her only best-selling book, The Autobiography of Alice Toklas, a book she wrote from the perspective of her partner in order to praise herself in the third person as a genius. And to her credit, Stein was a fairly successful multidisciplinarian in her own right, having been a successful writer, novelist, playwright, and choreographer, all whilst being openly gay and Jewish during a very accepting century.
She was a very handsome Roman emperor.
However, my lasting opinion on Stein is kind of stained. After reading Hemingway's book and various other publications, she often comes off as a bitter and jealous woman, referring to other writers as vicious, pathetic trash, only speaking favorably of those she was friendly with who promoted her own career or were just evidently unthreatening. And this is why I shared the story of Picasso trying to share his poetry earlier. Not exactly encouraging. She literally tells him to go home and paint, to stay in his lane. It seems Stein fell victim to the myth of zero-sum game. The fallacy of zero-sum thinking, the idea that somebody must fail at the expense of someone's success, fails to recognize the mutually beneficial prospects of collaboration and the exchange of free ideas. People often see shares of a market as fractional pieces of a limited pie. However, we also fail to realize that the pie, or the demand, is elastic and can grow by increasing the quality offerings of a market. And this isn't just the economics of commerce, but applies similarly to the marketplace of ideas. We cannot place contrived limitations on the potential of a movement, school of thought, or rising ideology. All those successful artists who arose from 20th century Paris created the demand. They were not competing, but rather pioneering a new landscape for arts and culture, a frontier large enough to sustain all of their pursuits. Collaboration inevitably outperforms competition. Picasso and Hemingway had a turbulent relationship, yet they periodically made the effort to meet up even when they were both wildly successful. Reportedly, they never said much during these encounters, but it's always the thought that counts. You are the sum of your influence and the average of those you spend the most time with. The great consort with great. And competitiveness is not to be discouraged entirely, simply recontextualized as a potent motivator between peers rather than the malicious, primitive instinct to extinguish competitors. Consider the artists and the movements that we looked at today. There were plenty of bitter rivalries and friendly clashing, but history remembers them as contributors to a movement. None of their successes voiding the others, just symbiotic growth. In our own time, modern technologies emphasize deeper levels of specialization and greater levels of collaboration between disciplines. The current assault of artificial intelligence and machine learning should be signal enough for you to want to expand your means of expression, to collaborate with others, and to dig deeper into human connectivity. Just like the artists of the 20th century pioneered new grounds, the creatives of our generation will explore and innovate together.